Welcome to another wonderful Marjorie Evans audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Marjorie Evans, contemporary Christian romance author. Now find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. The Angel Next Door. Chapter 1. Melinda Roth could barely keep her eyes open. As her friends and neighbors filed inside North Avenue Church for the Sunday morning service, she adjusted her position on the back pew again to try and stay awake. Her 9-month-old son Isaac slept comfortably on her lap as people stopped by to dote over him, and Melinda did her best to act cordial, all the while hoping and praying they wouldn't awaken him. It was the 8th day following Isaac's adoption and arrival from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it was also the 8th day Melinda struggled to function after another sleepless night. The mild transition the adoption agency prepared her for was actually a nightmare of epic proportions, and so far no light could be seen at the end of the tunnel. Melinda smiled wearily when she saw her parents and older sister Jan enter the church, but her smile faded when her mom and dad went in the opposite direction while Jan joined her on the back pew. "You look horrible," Jan commented. Melinda cocked a brow before elbowing her in the side. "It's good to see you too, sis." Jan leaned over and caressed one of Isaac's chubby little cheeks, which made him stir for a few brief and tense seconds before drifting back to sleep. "For the love of all things holy, please don't wake him up," Melinda whispered. Jan crossed her legs and adjusted her skirt. "Another long night, huh?" Melinda nodded as she glanced across the sanctuary to where her parents were now seated beside their next-door neighbors, the Andersons, and she sighed heavily as she watched them talking and laughing. "I see they're still avoiding me," she noted. She tried to hide the disappointment in her voice, but when Jan rolled her eyes heavenward, she guessed she wasn't doing a very good job. "Mel, please don't start with that again. You're being ridiculous." Before she had the chance to object, the church pianist started pounding away on the keys and Pastor Weeks entered through a door near the pulpit to take his place behind the podium. The music director took the mic and the congregation grabbed their hymnals and stood, but Melinda remained seated and covered Isaac's ears, in a vain attempt to keep their singing from waking him up. Normally, being in church with her family and friends was the highlight of her week, but with her parents acting so strangely since Isaac's adoption, the atmosphere felt different. Jan refused to believe it, but Melinda knew in her heart that their indifference stemmed from the fact that Isaac was from Africa. But that wasn't all. She'd also strayed from the course when she chose a child before marriage, which many people in her community, including her parents, believed wasn't the proper thing to do. Melinda's jaw tensed and her head began to throb. She'd never been one to give much consideration to the opinions of others, but she had to admit their pettiness stung. 2 years prior, during her first mission trip to Rwanda with AgriCorps, she knew she'd found her calling in life. Her heart ached when she thought back to the destitution she'd witnessed there, as families peddled their wares on the streets and lived in homes that were nothing more than shanties held together by a wing and a prayer. The orphanages where she'd spent her weeks assisting children were filled to overflowing with kids of all ages in need of a loving family, and as soon as Melinda returned home, she'd contacted an adoption agency and began the long and arduous task of raising money to bring one of those children to the United States through adoption. She let out her breath and smiled as she ran her fingers through Isaac's ebony curls. While she hadn't been able to adopt a child from Rwanda, she had been able to adopt from the neighboring country of the Democratic Republic of Congo. What a blessing that her dream had finally become a reality. Jan nudged her side to get her attention, and she bowed her head and closed her eyes when she realized Pastor Weeks was in the middle of his opening prayer. She silently reprimanded herself for getting so lost in her own thoughts that she forgot where she was, and throughout the rest of the service, she kept her eyes and ears peeled to the pastor and every word he said. She felt particularly beholden as Pastor Weeks had been a constant source of encouragement to her during the adoptive process. It wasn't just because she worked at the church either. He'd been genuinely interested. Isaac slept through most of the sermon, and Jan reached for him as soon as he woke up. Thankfully, her sister loved him unconditionally, unlike their parents, and it was easy to tell by Isaac's big grin that he adored her too. Melinda took a bottle of formula from his diaper bag and handed it to Jan so she could feed him, which kept him occupied during most of the remainder of the service. By the time Pastor Weeks asked everyone to bow their heads for the closing prayer, Jan had long finished feeding and burping him. As soon as Melinda heard Pastor Weeks' amen, she hurriedly gathered up Isaac's things so she could make a quick getaway. Unfortunately, though, Jan wasn't in as big a hurry, and when a couple of her co-workers stopped by their pew to ooh and ah over Isaac, Melinda had no other choice but to wait. From the corner of her eye, she saw her mom and dad making their way to the exit, and while Jan was occupied with Isaac, Melinda went to talk to them before they could escape. When she walked up behind them and lightly grasped her dad's arm to get his attention, he turned to her with a feigned look of surprise on his face. "Hello, sweetheart. How are you?" He kissed her cheek while her mother looked on in silence. Several members of the congregation tried to scoot past them on their way out the door, and so the three of them moved to the side to get out of the way. "I'm doing fine," she replied, cringing at her own lie. "I was hoping you would come sit with me and Isaac during the service." A hesitant look passed between her parents before her mother did her usual tap dance around the subject to try and appease her. "I'm sorry, honey. We didn't know you were here." Melinda bit her tongue to keep from saying something she'd surely regret later. She'd caught her mother staring at her right before she took her seat, so her excuse was invalid, but Melinda wasn't about to correct her. Anyway, what was the use? She refused to beg for the love and affection any other normal grandparent would willingly extend to their grandchild. "Why don't we get some lunch?" Melinda suggested. "My treat." Her parents exchanged another tentative look before they both shook their heads in unison. Her father cleared his throat. "I wish we could, sweetie, but I have some papers to finish grading and your mother is working on her spring curriculum." It was the usual teacher speak she was accustomed to, but since the high school where both her parents taught was closed for the upcoming spring break, she knew it was just another lame excuse. Before she could call them out on it, however, Jan appeared by her side with Isaac in her arms. "I was wondering where you ran off to," Jan said. "He's getting fussy." Melinda took Isaac from her and lightly bounced him up and down to stop his whimpering while her parents stood by and watched without offering to help. Melinda was envious of the other young mothers in the congregation whose babies were passed back and forth between grandparents eager to play with them. The most Isaac could get from her mother and father was a brief pat on the back. "We should be going," her father said. Melinda nibbled on her bottom lip to keep from tearing up as they gave her and Jan a quick hug before walking to the exit without so much as another glance in their direction. "Do you still think I'm being ridiculous?" Melinda muttered. Her sister frowned as she draped an arm across Melinda's shoulders and led her toward the door. "I'm sorry, sis. I wish I knew what to say. Do you want me to talk to them? I don't know what good it would do, but I could give it a shot." Melinda shook her head. If her parents were that oblivious to the effect of their actions, she wasn't going to point it out to them. With any luck, they would realize eventually what they were missing out on and make an effort to be a part of Isaac's life. If not, well then, so be it. Let's get a bite to eat and talk about something more pleasant. Does that lunch offer I overheard extend to me? Melinda grinned. Of course it does. When they left the church, she hugged Isaac close to her side and held her head high. No matter what, she would not let her parents' backward thinking interfere with his upbringing. She was determined to give him the life he deserved, with or without their help. Chapter 2. Josh sat straight up in bed as soon as he heard what appeared to be a child crying. First, he thought he was dreaming, but as he listened closely, he could very distinctly hear an infant sobbing. As he scooted to the edge of the bed and slipped on his house shoes, He glanced at his alarm clock on the nightstand and groaned when he saw it was almost 2 in the morning. He slowly trudged his way from his bedroom to the front door, flipping on lights as he went, and the crying grew louder with each step. He could tell it was coming from the corridor outside his apartment, and when he cracked the door open and peeked outside, he saw his neighbor Melinda pacing the hallway with a baby in her arms. He'd heard through the grapevine that she'd adopted, but since he'd recently returned from spending 2 weeks in England visiting his family, it was the first time he'd seen the child. He wanted to help, but he didn't know where to begin or if she'd even appreciate the offer. For all he knew, she might be easily offended. Josh decided it was probably best to leave them be, but as he went to close the door, he heard a man bellowing from the hallway. "I have an important meeting first thing in the morning, and I need my rest. Shut that kid up." Josh flung his door open wide and stepped outside, and his temper bristled when he saw their neighbor, Evan Sanders, yelling at Melinda and causing a scene. He'd never gotten along with the pushy and very arrogant lawyer, and when Josh approached them and saw tears glistening in Melinda's eyes, he curled his fists by his side. "Is there a problem, Evan?" Evan gestured to the baby before throwing his hands in the air. "Are you deaf? He's crying and screaming." I'm so sorry," Melinda stammered. "Usually walking the corridor puts him right to sleep. That's why I'm out here. I'm so sorry." Some of their other neighbors opened their doors to see what was going on, but Josh assured them there wasn't a problem, and they all went back inside their apartments. Still, Evan hadn't budged, and when he raised his voice even louder and threatened to call the landlord, Josh stepped between the two of them. "You need to take a step back," Josh threatened. She apologized, so let it go. Melinda looked tired enough to fall over. "I'll go back in now. I didn't mean to wake you all up." Evan, who was smaller in size and at least 6 inches shorter than Josh, looked up at him with wary eyes and attempted to puff out his chest, but he looked more absurd than daunting, and it didn't take long for him to scurry back to his apartment. When they were finally alone, Josh turned to face Melinda and saw tears rolling down her cheeks, which she hastily wiped away with the back of her hand. "Thank you, Josh. I feel like a fool." Although they'd been neighbors for a couple of years, this was one of the few times he could recall standing face to face with her, and he was immediately drawn in by her sultry hazel eyes, which left him momentarily nonplussed. She had on pajama bottoms, a t-shirt, and fuzzy pink socks, and her long brown hair cascaded over her shoulders in soft waves that framed her face and made his heart beat a little faster. "It's no problem," he replied. "I'm sorry. Evan can be such a jerk sometimes." "No, he's right. I shouldn't be out here when the baby is crying. It's just that usually he settles down when I walk the hallway." The baby stopped crying as soon as he zeroed in on Josh, which seemed to surprise Melinda, whose jaw relaxed when she caught the baby smiling at him. "I can't believe it," she exclaimed. "This is the first time I've seen him smile nearly all day. But still, I'm very sorry I woke you up." Josh made some funny faces at the baby, and it didn't take long before the child was laughing, which made his heart swell. The baby was quite adorable, from his curly black hair to his chubby little feet. "He's very sweet. What's his name?" Melinda shifted him from her right hip to her left, and he could tell by the look on her face that she was getting tired from holding him. There was no telling how long she'd been walking the halls, and the weariness was stark in her eyes. "His name is Isaac," she responded. "I adopted him from an orphanage overseas a little over 2 weeks ago, but the transition isn't going as well as I'd hoped it would." Josh was impressed. Most of the young women he knew were so self-absorbed they would probably never even consider adopting a child, and especially not one from a foreign country. He didn't know Melinda very well, but her selfless act spoke volumes about her character, and that intrigued him. "May I?" he asked as he extended his hands to Isaac. Before she could reply, Isaac held up his hands and leaned toward Josh, who swept him up in his arms, making him giggle. Melinda smiled as she massaged her shoulders. Besides my sister, Jan, you're the only person he's allowed to hold him since he's been here. Are you some kind of magician? Josh laughed. I have several nieces and nephews, so I've had a lot of practice with babies. Isaac stretched his little arms and legs and let out a big yawn. When he rested his head on Josh's shoulder, Josh gestured for Melinda to walk with him, hoping the movement would make Isaac fall asleep so she could get some rest. I haven't seen you around lately, she said softly. Have you been away on vacation? Josh grimaced before nodding. I wish that was the case, but I was in England taking care of my grandfather. He was diagnosed with lung cancer several months ago, and I took care of him in his final days because, well, let's just say death can bring out the worst in some people, especially family members who think they're entitled to something. Remembering the way his relatives acted over his grandfather's will left a bitter taste in his mouth, and he shook his head to clear his mind. He was in no mood to get riled up over it all over again. I know what you mean, she remarked, keeping her voice very low. I'm sorry about your grandfather. It sounds like he was lucky to have you. They reached the end of the hallway, and when they turned around to walk back, his arm brushed against hers, giving him a zap of tingles. He swallowed and focused back on the topic at hand. I doubt I'll hear from my family in England anytime soon, but I respected his last wishes, and I'm at peace with that. If they let their greed come between us, there isn't much I can do except pray for them. He heard Melinda sigh, and when he looked at her, he detected a palpable sadness within her that reached out and grabbed his heart. I understand that too, she murmured. My parents and I haven't been on the best of terms since I went on my first mission trip to Rwanda a couple of years ago. When I visited the orphanages, I just knew in my heart that I was meant to adopt a child in need, but they never understood that. They thought I was being too hasty and that I should wait and get married before having children of my own. Do things the right way. She shrugged. I got this little fellow from the Congo. He could sense the sadness in her voice, and he didn't interrupt because he could also sense she had a lot more she needed to get off her chest. He glanced down at Isaac and smiled when he noticed his little lips were puckered, and he was sound asleep. I thought once Isaac arrived, they would mellow a bit, but that never happened. In fact, they've been acting even more strangely. They would never admit it, but I know they have something against his skin color, and that is really upsetting. Josh furrowed a brow. Have you tried talking to them about it? She sighed again as she shook her head. No, but I will as soon as I can get them to stay in a room with me for more than 5 seconds. They walked in silence for a couple of minutes, and when they arrived at Melinda's apartment door, she gestured for him to follow her. She opened the door slowly, but when the hinges squeaked, every muscle in Josh tensed. Isaac stirred for a brief moment before nodding back to sleep, and as Josh followed Melinda through her apartment to the nursery, he walked as stealthily as he could to keep Isaac from waking up. He carefully laid him in his crib and backed away, and when Melinda closed his bedroom door behind them, they both expelled a sigh of relief. Josh didn't know how long he'd been holding his breath, but he felt as if he'd just been through some kind of military training exercise. He shook his head and smiled. How could something so small cause so much exhaustion? They both eased away from Isaac's room and made their way back to the living room. Would you care to sit for a while? She asked. He sank onto the sofa and she joined him. I don't know how you do it, he commented. What do you mean? Josh leaned against the cushions and crossed his arms over his chest. I feel like I've just run a marathon and you haven't even broken a sweat. That must be one of your mother's superpowers. She blushed and rubbed the soles of her feet against the rug on the floor. I don't know about that, but it's sweet of you to say. Thank you for helping me. I'm so sorry Isaac woke you, but I appreciate your help more than you know. He shooed away her thanks with a wave of his head. It's no problem at all. Hopefully he'll sleep for a few hours. He glanced at the clock on her living room wall and cringed when he saw it was almost 4. In a couple of hours, he would have to start getting ready for work. I should go and let you get some rest. He got up and went for the door, but his heart leapt to his throat when Melinda rose and reached out to grab his arm. Her small hand was soft and warm against his skin and made the tiny hairs on the back of his neck stand at attention. Josh, I'm sorry if I bombarded you with my family problems. Sometimes my mouth doesn't check in with my brain before I speak. And I'm just so tired. He cleared his throat before attempting a reply. There's no need to apologize. You can talk to me about anything, anytime. Her cheeks reddened again before she let him go, and Josh smiled at her one last time before leaving. As he turned the doorknob, he noticed his hand trembled slightly. Even though he tried to attribute it to his concern over Isaac, he knew without a doubt it was less about Isaac and more about Melinda Roth. Chapter 3. Melinda knocked on Jan's door for a third time. She could hear movement inside her sister's apartment, but it took a fourth knock to get her to answer the door. When she opened it, Melinda could tell by her haggard appearance that her cooking venture wasn't going well. "Come in," Jan exclaimed before darting back inside the apartment. "I need to get this meatloaf out of the oven before it burns." As soon as Melinda entered the apartment, the pungent scent coming from the direction of the kitchen nearly knocked her down. She stifled a cough before setting Isaac's diaper bag on a table near the front door. "I'm sorry about this, sweetie," she whispered to Isaac. "Your poor Aunt Jan can barely boil water, so it looks like we're in for a treat." When he smiled and giggled, Melinda pulled him close and kissed his forehead. After Josh managed to get him to sleep the night before, he'd been in a great mood all day, something that didn't happen often, and she was enjoying it while it lasted. Melinda went to the kitchen and caught Jan dashing around the room, which was a complete disaster area, with dirty dishes and empty cans littering the countertops and what looked like flour or sugar strewn across the floor. "I can't believe I forgot to make a glaze. We can't have meatloaf without a glaze." She was in full-blown panic mode, and Melinda grabbed the back of her apron when she rushed past her. "Whoa! Slow down." When Jan turned to face her, Melinda saw there were 2 flour splotches on her cheeks and a tiny piece of eggshell in her long blonde hair. She tried not to laugh, but she couldn't contain it, and when she erupted in a fit of laughter, Jan put her hands on her hips and gave her a resentful glare. "I'm glad one of us can find the humor in this situation." Melinda handed Isaac to her before giving her an affectionate pat on the back. "Go sit down. I'll take care of it." Jan didn't hesitate, and when she took Isaac to the adjoining dining room and sat down at the table, Melinda started cleaning off the countertops. "Good heavens, January. It looks like a bomb went off in here. I wish you hadn't gone through so much trouble. I would have been just as happy eating dinner with you at the cafe across the street." Jan mumbled something she couldn't understand, and when Melinda leaned over the counter to see what she was doing, she caught her playing peekaboo with Isaac, who was looking up at her with wide eyes. The sight of them together eased something in her soul. Once the countertop was clear of debris and the floor had been swept, Melinda went to the refrigerator and rummaged through its contents until she found what she needed for a glaze. After mixing the ingredients together in a small glass bowl, she inspected the meatloaf to make sure it was cooked through and was surprised to discover it actually didn't look half bad. "This looks delicious, January. Where did you get the recipe?" She could hear Jan sigh from the other room. "It was printed on the meatloaf seasoning packet." Melinda bit her tongue to keep from laughing. Her sister sounded so pitiful, and it was unusual seeing her feathers ruffled, but Melinda had to admit it was kind of nice being the sister in control for once, since Jan was usually the calm and collected one. Melinda spread the ketchup and brown sugar mixture evenly over the top of the meatloaf before placing it in the oven to bake a few more minutes. The mashed potatoes and green beans were already cooked and ready to be served, so she transferred them to 2 serving bowls and carried them to the dining room. "It won't be long now," she told January. "Just a couple more minutes and the meatloaf should be ready." When she set the bowls on the dining room table, she noticed there were 4 place settings instead of just 2. Is someone joining us? She asked. No sooner had the question left her mouth when the doorbell rang. Now, Mel, promise me you won't get angry. Jan stood and handed Isaac back to her. Melinda could see the hesitation in her eyes, and it was suddenly clear to her just who was at the front door. Please tell me you didn't invite Mom and Dad. Jan backed away slowly and started edging toward the front door. You promised you wouldn't be mad. Melinda glared at her. I did no such thing. Jan disappeared into the entry before she could protest, and a few seconds later she heard her parents' voices. She wanted to bolt, but her feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. She glanced down helplessly at Isaac, who was preoccupied playing with her necklace. I promise I'll try and break us out of here as soon as possible, she told him. Her mom and dad appeared at the dining room door, and Melinda forced a smile, but she could tell by the looks on their faces that they were just as surprised to see her there. Jan cowered behind them, and Melinda made a mental note to ream her out about it later, as soon as she could get her alone. Hello, sweetheart, her dad said. We didn't know you'd be joining us. Melinda cast a wayward glance at January. Yes, that seems to be the common theme around here tonight. The timer on the oven went off, and Melinda made a move toward the kitchen, but Jan jumped out from behind their parents and beat her to it. I'll get it, she said quickly. You guys have a seat and I'll be right back. When Jan left, the silence in the room roared. Melinda sat down at the table while her parents sat across from her. She frowned when she realized she'd forgotten Isaac's high chair and she would have to hold him and somehow try to eat too, but she shrugged it off. With any luck, Isaac would behave, because the last thing she needed was another reason for her parents to dislike her son. Awkwardness flowed between them, and Melinda kept glancing toward the kitchen, hoping Jan would reappear and ease the tension. She could hear her banging around and she contemplated checking on her, but she knew it would only make her sister upset, since it was so obvious she had high hopes for Melinda and her parents to talk things out. So, have you returned to work yet? Her dad asked. Isaac started squirming on her lap, and she gave him the spoon beside her dinner plate to try and keep him occupied. I have 2 more weeks of vacation left. Right now, I'm interviewing potential babysitters. Her father leaned forward and put his elbows on the table. Don't they have a daycare center at the church? Why can't Ivan stay there when you go back to work? Melinda felt her temper flare, and she chewed on her bottom lip to keep from saying something she shouldn't. Isaac is only 9 months old, and they don't accept anyone under a year. His spot is already reserved for when the time comes, but until then, I've got to use a babysitter. If her father noticed her annoyance over the name mix-up, he didn't let on, and her mother sat idly by with her back straight and her fingers laced together on top of the table. Isaac started cooing, and Melinda smiled when he looked at her father and started giggling, which made her father give him a grudging smile. Nevertheless, Melinda thought it could have been a very sweet interaction, even though neither parent was prepared to acknowledge it. Her mother got up and went into the kitchen. Would you like to hold him? She asked her dad. Her father stiffened and leaned back into his seat. Not right now. Perhaps after dinner. The corners of Melinda's eyes filled with tears, but she took a couple of deep breaths to remain calm. She refused to cry in front of him, but she couldn't control the disappointment that flooded her heart. It's because he's black, isn't it? She blurted out before she could stop herself. There, she'd said it, and there was no taking it back. Jan entered the room just as her father sat up straight in his chair and gave her an incredulous look. Course it isn't. What kind of person do you think I am? Jan put the serving tray of meatloaf on the table and backed away, but her mother furrowed a brow and looked questioningly between the two of them. What's going on? She asked. Her father's face was now beet red as he pointed an accusing finger at Melinda. She just asked me if I had something against Isaac being black. Well, at least he got his name right this time. Her mother's jaw dropped as she crossed her arms haughtily over her chest and stared at Melinda with unmistakable resentment. Melinda Marie, Why would you ask such a thing? Isaac started whimpering, and Melinda bounced him on her knee to try and keep him from crying. What else am I supposed to think? She answered quickly. The two of you never hold him or talk to him. You act like you're ashamed of him, and I want to know why. Her parents looked at each other, but neither of them said a word for a long time. Jan remained quiet and kept her eyes glued to the floor. He isn't yours, her mother finally said. Melinda gaped at her. She couldn't believe what she was hearing, and her mother's statement hurt almost as much as thinking that their actions had something to do with the color of Isaac's skin. He isn't mine? Are you crazy? Is that what the problem is, the fact that I didn't give birth to him? She asked. My blood may not run through his veins, but he is my son. Jan put her hands up and stepped forward. Okay, let's stop right here and try to enjoy a peaceful dinner before the food gets cold. I worked hard on this meal, and we're all going to eat it and enjoy it. You can resume this conversation afterwards. Melinda and her parents stared at January. Isaac gurgled in Melinda's arms. Fine, snapped her mother. Fine, Melinda echoed in the same harsh tone. She wondered how she would even get one bite of food down, feeling the way she did. But for Jan's sake, she'd try. After the meal was over, Jan stood to clear the table. I'll help, Melinda said, standing up with Isaac balanced on her hip. No, Jan said. In fact, I'm going to clean this up later. Give Isaac to me. I'll entertain him while you and Mom and Dad talk. Melinda reluctantly handed her son to Jan and then sank back down to her chair. I'm not racist, her father said immediately. How you could think such a thing? Melinda shook her head. Pretty easily, as a matter of fact. Do you have any idea how much it hurts to have my own parents reject my son? We didn't reject him, her mother cried. Really, Melinda? You're being awfully melodramatic. Am I? Am I really? Melinda was on the verge of bursting into tears. If only she wasn't so tired and so emotional. She clasped her hands together hard on her lap, willing herself to stay seated, willing herself to keep her voice steady. This is a big change to us, too. Melinda stared at her mother. So, this is about you? Don't you speak to your mother like that, her father said. You sprang this on us all. I hardly sprang it on anyone. I've been working for 2 years to adopt a child. We never thought you would do it, her father snapped. So, there it was. They didn't think she would do it? Were they so out of touch with her? Did they know her so little? Melinda stood up, her legs shaking. She grasped the edge of the table. Dad, Mom, I'm tired. She inhaled deeply. I'm glad you say this isn't a race issue. She nearly choked on the words because, in truth, she wasn't sure she believed them. Nevertheless, she swallowed and forged on. And I'm sorry that it's a whatever issue it is. I can't pretend to understand you right now. I can't even pretend to like you very much right now. But as I said, I'm tired. Exhausted. I'm probably not thinking straight. I'm going home now. We'll talk more later. Melinda, her mother said, moving to her. No, Mom. Not right now. I'm taking Isaac home. It's his bedtime. We'll talk later. Melinda picked up the diaper bag, swung through Jan's front room, scooped up Isaac from her sister's lap, and left the apartment. Chapter 4. It was nearing midnight when Josh stepped off the elevator. After spending 14 hours at the office trying to catch up on the paperwork that had accumulated during his leave of absence, he was worn out and ready to crash. Every muscle in his body hurt, and trying to put one foot in front of the other was a chore. He rounded the corner of the corridor, and his heart raced when he spotted Melinda sitting on the floor outside her apartment door. Isaac was straddled across her lap with his head resting on her chest, and they both appeared to be sound asleep. His own fatigue vanished instantly, and he tiptoed over and sat down beside them as quietly as he could, but Melinda woke up when his shoulder brushed against hers. She seemed startled at first, and she put her arms protectively around Isaac, but once she realized it was Josh, she relaxed again and gave him a weary smile. "Rough night?" he asked. Melinda nodded and yawned. "I don't know what it is about this hallway, but it only took a couple of laps to put him out this time. Don't worry. I made sure he didn't wake anyone. I planned to sit here just a few minutes, but I must have fallen asleep. What time is it?" He pulled up his shirt sleeve and showed her his watch, which made her groan out loud. "I can't keep this up," she said. "I don't see how single mothers handle the stress. I walk around in a daze all day long and I can't stay awake." Josh reached inside the plastic bag he was carrying from the all-night deli he'd stopped at on the way home and pulled out a small container. "Would cheesecake help?" Melinda's eyes lit up and she gave him a big smile. "Cheesecake always helps." He fumbled around inside the bag for the plastic cutlery but came up empty. "I'll get a fork from my apartment." He went to stand, but she grabbed his arm and kept him still. "No need." She opened the container and scooped up the cheesecake as if she were wrangling a slice of pizza, and when she took a huge bite of it, Josh started laughing. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know this probably isn't very ladylike, but I haven't had anything to eat since lunch." He shook his head and laughed again. "Doesn't bother me at all." Josh stretched his legs out in front of him. One of my nephews had colic when he was a baby, so I did some research online earlier to see if that might be what's causing Isaac to cry so much, but everything I read said that colic usually appears right after a child is born and goes away within 3 months. Melinda looked at him and smiled. "That was very sweet of you to do the research, Josh." "Thanks." He nodded but kept his face averted so she wouldn't see his face flush. Melinda shifted her position and crisscrossed her legs, but Isaac didn't budge and Josh couldn't resist squeezing one of his chubby little legs. "So, what has you sneaking home at this time of night?" she asked. "Hot date." He looked at her and hoped he might detect a hint of jealousy in her voice, but unfortunately, he didn't. She gave him a sly smile before nudging him playfully in his ribs. "No date to speak of unless you count staying late at the office with my computer a clandestine rendezvous." His comment made her laugh, softly, and it was a peaceful sound that washed over his frayed nerves and soothed them. She was dressed in a pair of shorts and a t-shirt, and her face was clear of makeup. She looked absolutely beautiful, if a little worn out, and he felt a tongue-tied sitting so close to her. "I'm supposed to go back to work in a couple of weeks, but I'm worried I won't be able to find a babysitter who can deal with his crankiness. I'm a secretary at North Avenue Church and we have a daycare center there, but he can't attend until he's a year old." She sighed heavily as she closed the empty dessert container and put it on the floor beside her. "What about your parents? Could they keep him or are things still tense between you?" She leaned her head back against the wall and looked up at the lights lining the corridor. "I had dinner with them and Jan a couple of nights ago, and I came right out and asked them if they were distancing themselves from Isaac because he's black, and they got very upset. Then my mother claimed that she has a problem with him not being my biological son. That's what she said, anyway. Of course, that might be only to cloak her real reason." Josh could tell by the way her eyes suddenly glistened with tears that she was deeply bothered, and even though he'd never met her parents, their callous attitude annoyed him too. Before he could talk himself out of it, Josh reached over and held her hand, and he was happy to see her cheeks turn a bright shade of pink in response. "Just because you're not blood-related doesn't make you any less of a mother to him. You gave him a home and you love him and would do anything in the world for him. Melinda, you are his mother in every sense of the word." She squeezed his hand and smiled. "Thanks for saying that. Even if we were on better terms, though, they wouldn't be able to babysit Isaac because they're both full-time teachers. My sister Jan can't keep him either because she works the evening shift at the hospital. He was pleasantly surprised when she didn't release his hand right away, and his heart rate escalated when she absently ran the pad of her thumb across his skin. Josh cleared his throat before speaking. "I believe the right person will come along," he said. "My nieces and nephews have babysitters, so my siblings might be able to help. I'll call them tomorrow." Isaac started squirming and slowly opened his eyes, and Melinda let go of Josh's hand and carefully stood. He followed suit, and she hugged Isaac close to her body and tried to soothe him. Josh hummed a lullaby, something he'd done numerous times with his nieces and nephews. It didn't take long before Isaac's eyelids grew heavy, and he drifted back to sleep. Melinda gestured to her apartment door, and Josh opened it so she could go inside. He kept humming as they walked to the nursery, and Melinda laid Isaac in his crib. Isaac curled his tiny fists and pouted, but as soon as she started rubbing his stomach, he relaxed and went back to sleep. She and Josh backed away from the crib and tiptoed out the bedroom door, and when they made it to the living room, Josh stopped humming and expelled a long breath. "We've really got to stop meeting like this," Melinda said with a grin. "I know you must be tired of helping me get Isaac to sleep." Josh chuckled. "To be honest, I'm enjoying it. I like spending time with you, with both of you. I was actually wanting to ask you if you'd like to go out to dinner with me sometime." Even in the dim light of the living room, he saw her hesitation and he held his breath, waiting for her answer. "I'd like that," she replied. "Maybe," she added quickly. "It all depends on Isaac." A mixture of relief and excitement flooded him, but he was also overcome by a sudden bout of uncertainty, something he hadn't experienced since he was a teenager in high school. "We'll take Isaac with us, of course," he said, wanting to reassure her. "I'll let you get some rest, but I'll come by tomorrow and we'll make plans then. I know you have a lot going on with the little guy, so I'll let you decide when and where you want to go. It doesn't matter to me. As long as I'm with you," he wanted to add but didn't. She blushed again, and Josh took that as his cue to leave before he did or said something to embarrass them both. Melinda followed him to the front door, and when he turned around to say goodnight, he didn't expect her to be standing so close behind him. She put her hand against his chest to keep them from bumping into each other, and his heart raced when he felt the heat from her touch through the thin fabric of his shirt. The urge to kiss her was overwhelming, but he didn't want to frighten her by going too fast, so he whispered a good night and left quickly before he changed his mind. When the door was closed between them, Josh felt a sense of hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He had become so tired of dealing with people who were out to get everything they could at whatever cost. His thoughts returned to his greedy relatives, and he shook his head. In contrast, Melinda Roth was like a breath of fresh air. Chapter 5. Melinda stared out the waiting room window of the Grandview Children's Clinic and watched the storm clouds gathering on the horizon while Isaac napped in her arms. After a disastrous morning spent trying to stop his tears, she'd reached the end of her rope. She'd tried everything Jan and her well-meaning friends had suggested, but nothing was helping, and she was beside herself. Enough was enough. She could hear thunder rolling in the distance, and she groaned when she realized it would probably rain throughout her and Josh's entire date later that evening. They went at all. She considered calling him and suggesting another night, but it had been so long since she'd dated anyone, and she didn't want to mess this up. Josh was a nice man, and the fact that Isaac seemed to like him was a huge bonus. "Jan said I would find you here." The sound of her mother's voice startled her, and when she looked up and discovered her standing a couple of feet away, she was stunned. "Mom? What are you doing here? Is something wrong? Is Dad okay?" Her mother frowned and shushed her as she sat down next to her and patted her knee. "Nothing is wrong, and your father is fine. I came by your apartment to see you, and when you didn't answer the door, I called Jan," she explained. "She told me you'd be here and what's been going on with Isaac." It was the first time Melinda could recall her mother saying his name, and it brought a sense of relief even though she was wary. Why this sudden show of concern? Things had been left up in the air since their dinner at Jan's. "Aren't you supposed to be packing right now?" Melinda asked. She stole a glance at the clock on the wall and saw it was almost 2 in the afternoon. "Jan said you and Dad were going to spend the remainder of your spring break in Tennessee." Her mother shook her head as she set her purse down in the empty chair to her left. "I'll have plenty of time left to pack." Melinda grimaced. She could hardly believe that the school's spring break was about to be over. Since Isaac's arrival, the days seemed to run together endlessly, and she barely knew which end was up anymore. She glimpsed at the woman sitting 2 rows in front of her, who was multitasking between reading a magazine, talking on her cell phone, and tending to 2 young children who couldn't have been older than 5. Her clothes weren't disheveled, her makeup was flawless, and her hair was perfectly styled. Melinda ran her fingers through her long brown tendrils and groaned when she thought about how fortunate she was to remember to brush her hair at all before she left her apartment. "You learn as you go," her mother said. Melinda narrowed her eyes at her mother, who motioned to the young woman she'd been staring at. "Children don't come with instruction manuals." That woman was a first-time mother at one time, too. "You just have to learn as you go and put your trust in God to get you through it," she explained. "It doesn't hurt to pray for a little sanity for yourself, too." Melinda blinked. Could this really be her mother sitting beside her doling out comforting advice? What was going on? And if she was being sincere and Melinda wasn't at all sure that she was, what had caused the change? "I'm sorry, your father, and I haven't been very supportive," her mother said as if reading her mind. "We knew we'd be grandparents someday, but we never expected it would be this way. It isn't, well, I thought you would marry first. And we had hoped to see our family line carried on. You know, through our bloodline." Melinda didn't respond, she was still too stunned. "We do admire what you've done for Isaac, but you have to understand that you're still our baby and we worry about you." Melinda blinked hard. So, they were worried? In Melinda's mind, if they'd truly been worried, they would have helped her from the start. In spite of herself, Melinda's eyes welled with tears, and she wasn't sure if they were angry tears or relieved tears. Maybe both. Her mother was looking at her, and Melinda thought she detected a touch of regret somewhere in her gaze. But maybe her mother did feel badly about it. Maybe she was sincere. Melinda was so exhausted, she didn't trust herself to make a fair assessment. She blew out her breath. On the other hand, did it matter? What was done, and her mother was there now, sitting with them both, seemingly offering her help and support. Melinda nodded, and when her mother draped an arm around her and pulled her close so she could rest her head on her shoulder, tears did fill her eyes. "I don't know how difficult being a single mom must be, but I think you're doing a good job." Well, I'm proud of you," her mother said quietly. That was all it took to make the tears roll down Melinda's cheeks, and she didn't have the energy to wipe them away. "Now, tell me about this young man you're going out with tonight," her mother said. Melinda jerked up from her mother's shoulder. So Jan had blabbed. Melinda sucked in her breath. Was that the real reason her mother was there? To find out about her date with Josh? She shuddered. She didn't like being such a suspicious person. She didn't like wondering about possible ulterior motives. Her mother's brows were raised, and she was clearly expecting an answer. Melinda sighed. "He lives in the apartment across the hall from me, and he's very sweet. He works in a big accounting firm downtown, and Isaac's face lights up every time he sees him." Isaac started wiggling around on her lap, and she sat up straighter. He opened his eyes, and Melinda rocked him back and forth when his little lips puckered, and he started whimpering. A few seconds later, a nurse appeared at the door and called out his name. "Will you be here when we get back?" Melinda asked, standing up. Her mother grabbed her purse and reached for Isaac's diaper bag. "What do you mean?" "I'm coming in with you." Melinda nearly stumbled at her mother's words, but she recovered quickly, and they both joined the nurse, who showed them to one of the examination rooms. The last thing she had expected when she arrived at the clinic was any sort of reconciliation with her mother, but she was inordinately pleased with this unexpected turn of events. As the nurse asked her questions and filled out some paperwork, Isaac held out his arms to Melinda's mother. She took him and bounced him in her arms, and Melinda's heart melted when Isaac looked up at her mother and gave her a silly grin. It was an unforgettable moment. Chapter 6. "Would you stop freaking out? You look gorgeous," Jan exclaimed. Melinda checked her reflection in the full-length mirror for what felt like the 100th time, but still something didn't look right. "This color makes me look pale. I need to change." Jan jumped off the bed and grabbed her by the shoulders before she could take a step toward the closet. "You will do no such thing. This dress looks perfect on you." Melinda pressed a hand to her stomach and took a couple of deep breaths to try and control the butterflies wreaking havoc on her nerves. "Jan, I don't know if I can do this. Do you know how long it's been since I went on a date? Besides, I'm a mother now." Melinda sat down on the bed where Isaac was busy sucking on a plastic boat. Jan sat beside her and reached for her hand. "Look, I know you're nervous and it's been a long time, but I have a feeling tonight is going to be wonderful and you deserve this, Mel. You've spent the past 2 years working so hard to get Isaac, and now it's your turn to relax and have some fun. At least for a couple of hours." Melinda looked at Isaac and smiled. "I don't know about that, but I'm happy to see someone around here is having a good time. This is the longest he's gone without crying." Jan stretched out on her side next to Isaac, who picked up a rattle and handed it to her. "The new formula the pediatrician recommended must be helping," Jan commented. Melinda went to the closet and started rummaging through her shoes to find her favorite pair of high heels. It would be wonderful if the problem were as simple as changing his formula, but I'm afraid to get my hopes up. Right now, I'm remaining tentatively optimistic. Melinda inhaled sharply when she heard the doorbell, and when Jan started clapping her hands together excitedly, she thought for certain she was going to be sick. She leaned against the closet door and shook her head. "I can't do this." Jan jumped off the bed and scooped up Isaac in her arms. "Oh, stop being so dramatic. Come on." She and Isaac both giggled as they sprinted from the room, and Melinda had no other choice but to follow them. Before leaving the room, she picked up her purse from the dresser and gazed in the mirror one last time. She could hear Josh at the front door, and when she rounded the corner to the entryway, her heart flipped when she saw how handsome he looked in his black dress slacks and long-sleeved blue dress shirt. His gaze widened when he saw her, and when his eyes roamed over her body, she felt her cheeks redden. "Wow," he said. "You look beautiful." Melinda thanked him, and she cringed when her voice came out sounding ridiculously squeaky. She cleared her throat as she retrieved her jacket from the wooden coat rack beside the door, and Josh stepped forward to help her put it on. She caught Jan's mischievous smile, and she nudged her side when she bent over to kiss Isaac's cheek. "So, Isaac isn't coming with us?" Josh asked. Disappointed? She couldn't help but ask. "I'm happy either way," he said. He raised one brow and gave her a slow smile. She tore her eyes away from him and looked at January. "Don't hesitate to call my cell phone if you need me." Jan shooed her and Josh out the door. "We'll be fine. You two go and have a great time. I'm just glad my shift got changed so I can do this." When she closed the door behind them, Melinda gave Josh a shy smile. She had no idea why she suddenly felt so bashful around him after they'd spent most of the week bonding over a crying baby and stories of crazy relatives, but now she could barely look him in the eye without blushing. "I meant what I said," he murmured. "You really are a sight to behold, Melinda." "'Kay, that didn't help matters." She felt the heat rush to her face again as he held out his arm, and she looped hers through it. "You look quite handsome, too," she murmured. Now it was his turn to be embarrassed, and her heart skipped a beat when his neck and face turned an adorable shade of red before he gave her a wink and thanked her. His cologne floated in the air around them, and the woodsy, masculine aroma tickled her senses and made her head swoon. She felt like a giddy schoolgirl, but it was a nice feeling and something she could definitely get used to. "How did it go with the pediatrician today?" he asked. When they boarded the elevator, he reached for her hand and intertwined his fingers through hers, which made her tremble and momentarily forget what they were talking about. "The doctor," he prompted. "It went well." He said Isaac's fussiness could in part be caused by the formula he's on, so he changed it to something that's supposed to be gentler on Isaac's tummy. "Oh, and you'll never guess who showed up while I was in the waiting room." When she relayed her surprise over her mother's unexpected visit, Josh listened attentively and told her how happy he was for her. Melinda knew he meant it, and her heart melted. He was by far the most thoughtful man she'd met in a very long time, and she could certainly see possibilities with him, but she didn't want to move too fast. Things were different now. Her life was no longer just her own, and she couldn't make decisions based solely on her own wants and needs. She had a child to consider, one who would always be her top priority, and that made her very mindful of the choices she was making. The evening turned out to be just as wonderful as Melinda had hoped it would be. Josh was the perfect gentleman, and when they finished their dinner, they remained in their cozy little corner of the restaurant for another hour, holding hands, talking, and just enjoying each other's company. When they left the restaurant, they strolled hand in hand to the city park across the street and continued their conversation on one of the wrought iron benches beside a fountain. Melinda felt renewed. In some ways, it felt like the first time she'd taken a relaxed breath in weeks and weeks. She hadn't truly understood the pressure she'd been under until she had a moment to let it go. Even so, she glanced at her cell phone every few minutes to assure herself that Jan hadn't called, in case the ringer wasn't working. Pure silliness, she knew, but still, it helped her to freely enjoy her time with Josh. Josh squeezed her hand. "While I was in England, I stumbled upon a park much smaller than this one that was surrounded by arched trellises covered in ivy. Weeds were poking through the cracks in the cobblestone walkway, and I could tell it had been neglected for quite some time, but it was so peaceful. I went there many times when I needed to get away from the stress of dealing with my family." Melinda shut her eyes and tried to picture it in her mind. "It sounds like a beautiful place." She sensed Josh inch closer to her, and goosebumps prickled her skin when she felt his warm breath close to her ear. "Maybe someday you can visit it," he whispered. Melinda's heart raced, and when she opened her eyes and saw Josh leaning toward her, she held her breath expectantly. His lips barely brushed hers at first, but it was enough to make her quiver from her head to her toes, and it didn't take long before his kiss intensified. He wrapped his arms around her, and the feeling of being safe and secure in his strong embrace was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. When they parted, he was breathing hard, and when he murmured her name, his voice was thick. It was a truly magical moment, but it ended far too quickly when the sound of her cell phone ringing jolted her back to reality. Melinda fumbled for her phone, and her breath quickened for an entirely different reason when she saw Jan's number on the caller ID. When she answered, the first sound she heard was Isaac crying in the background, and her heart fell to her feet. "Jan? What's wrong?" She jumped up and started pacing the brick-lined walkway by the fountain. "I'm so sorry, Mel. I've tried everything, but he won't stop crying, and I didn't know what else to do." Josh left the bench and walked over to join her. When he gently grasped her arm to keep her still, she could see the worry in his eyes. "Tell Jan we're coming home right now." As soon as she hung up the phone, they walked hurriedly to his car parked outside the restaurant and headed for home. When they made it to the apartment, Jan greeted them at the door with Isaac in her arms. His face was streaked with tears, and he was crying so hard he could barely catch a breath between sobs. He calmed a bit when Melinda took him and cradled him to her shoulder. "I shouldn't have gone out," Melinda moaned. She was the worst mother ever. What in the world had she been thinking to leave Isaac so soon? "I'm so sorry," Jan said. "I didn't want to call, but—" Josh shook his head. There's no need to apologize. You did the right thing. Melinda was aware of his disappointment, even while she was busy battling her own guilt over agreeing to go on a date in the first place. Josh was a good man, and she was sure there were plenty of single women without children who would love to go out with him. She needed to stop this foolishness before it went any further. She had a child to care for, one who needed all her love to adjust to this whole new world she'd brought him into. "I'll make you some tea," Jan offered, disappearing into the kitchen. "I should try and rock him to sleep," Melinda said. Josh nodded. "I understand. I'll come by and check on him tomorrow morning before I go to work if that's okay." Melinda didn't trust herself to look into his eyes, so she simply nodded, but as soon as he left, the tears started flowing and she didn't try to stop them. She liked Josh, but she couldn't in good conscience turn his life upside down by involving him any further with her responsibilities. But making her heart understand that was another issue altogether. Chapter 7. Josh rapped his knuckles on Melinda's door and listened closely to see if there was any movement or noise coming from inside, but all was quiet. It was the third day in a row he'd knocked on her door, called, and texted with no answer, and the worry that filled him was steadily mounting. He considered going to the landlord and asking him to unlock her door, but he didn't want to risk making Melinda angry by invading her privacy. She was obviously avoiding him, but he couldn't fathom why. He'd thought they were getting along well. Josh grimaced as he leaned against her door. Except for having to rush home early, their date had gone smoothly, but perhaps she didn't feel the same way, and that bugged him more than he cared to admit. He didn't know Jan's cell number or where Melinda's parents lived, so that was a dead end. The only other option he could think of was maybe Melinda had returned to work. It was also puzzling that Melinda was no longer walking the hallway during the night. The thought made him glad, however, as it could only mean that Isaac was sleeping better. Josh went to his apartment and grabbed his wallet and keys. It was worth a shot to try and find her at work, and he did know where North Avenue Church was located. As he walked to his car in the parking garage, he glanced at the spot labeled with Melinda's apartment number and noted that the space was empty. He got into his car, pulled out of the lot, and headed north. From what he remembered, the church was situated on the corner of 6th and Main, and when he turned the last corner in that direction, he could see the steeple peeking over the oak trees lining the street. He found an empty parking spot beside the front of the church, and when he stepped out, he saw Melinda's car parked a couple of spaces down in the section reserved for church employees. The building was enormous and quite lovely, but trying to decide which door to enter was next to impossible, so he decided to go through the front door and hope that someone would be in the sanctuary who could lead him in the right direction. Josh opened the heavy oak door and walked inside, and the first thing that caught his attention was the high ceiling that started at the foyer and carried on through the sanctuary. Sunlight beamed through the numerous stained glass windows and painted the room in a myriad of different colors. He stood in the middle of the quietness, completely awestruck. Church he attended across town was small and beautiful in its own right, but this one literally left him speechless. "May I help you?" Shaken from his reverie, Josh turned his attention to the elderly man who was standing in an open doorway near the podium. "I'm sorry," Josh said. "I was just admiring the architecture. It's really beautiful." The man closed the door and joined him in the center aisle. "It is definitely one of a kind," he replied. "I'm Nathan Weeks, the church pastor." He extended his right hand, and Josh shook it and introduced himself. They talked briefly about the church, but Josh could tell he was curious over why he was there, so he didn't beat around the bush. "I'm looking for Melinda Roth. She told me she works here." Pastor smiled and nodded. "Ah, you must be the Josh she's told me so much about lately. It's nice meeting you." Josh didn't know whether to be cautious or elated over Melinda mentioning his name to the pastor, but he didn't question it. When the man placed a hand on his shoulder and gestured to the door near the podium, Josh walked with him in that direction. "Her office is the second door on your left," Pastor Weeks said. He opened the door but didn't follow him into the hallway. "Feel free to go on in." Josh thanked him and continued down the corridor to the second door on the left. He knocked gently, and when he heard Melinda's voice on the other side, he was relieved. "Come in," she called. Josh opened the door, and he could tell by the surprised look on her face that he was the last person she'd expected to see. She was sitting behind a big mahogany desk, rummaging through a stack of paperwork while Isaac sat in a playpen in the middle of the room, cooing and playing with his toys. She blanched. "Josh? What are you doing here?" She attempted to stand, but Josh held up his hand to stop her. As he closed the door behind him, he went over and over in his mind what he should say, but all he really wanted to do was take her in his arms. He sat down in a chair across from her desk and tried to appear less nervous than he felt. "I didn't realize you'd gone back to work," he started, watching her carefully for her reaction. He still couldn't figure out whether she was glad to see him or not. "I haven't heard from you in a couple of days, and I was worried something may have happened to you or Isaac." She put down the papers and leaned back in her chair. She looked as stunning as ever, almost rested, but he could tell something was bothering her because her gaze flitted around as if she were nervous. "I haven't returned to work just yet. Pastor Weeks called me about some files he couldn't find, so I stopped by to help. I didn't mean to worry you. I've spent the past 2 nights at Jan's." She was keeping something from him, and his mind drifted back to their date. What had gone wrong that he hadn't realized? "Is something going on? Is it me?" he asked. "I thought things were going well between us." She stood and went to the window overlooking the parking lot, and although he wanted to go to her, he didn't move from his chair. Her voice was soft and low. "You haven't done anything wrong. I had a wonderful time on our date, but, well, I think I need to slow way down. I have a lot on my plate right now. There's a lot going on, and I need to be there 100% for my child." Maybe he hadn't realized the pressure she was under. He'd thought he was helping her, but if he was making things worse. "I am sorry." She turned around and leaned against the windowsill. She glanced his way briefly before turning her attention to Isaac, and he could see the shimmer of unshed tears in the corners of her eyes. Part of him wished he'd never asked because he had a sinking feeling that this was some sort of goodbye. "You're a wonderful man, Josh, and any woman would be lucky to have you. You shouldn't be tied down by a tired, stressed-out mom. You should be able to go out and paint the town and not have to worry about walking the floors with a crying infant. It's not fair to you, and I won't put you through it any longer. Besides, I need to do this on my own." He stood and went to her, and when he gently grasped her arms, he felt her body tense, which made his heart ache. "Melinda, you're not putting me through anything. I love being with you, and I've enjoyed every moment I've spent with you and Isaac, even the hours spent walking the floors." He attempted a laugh, but she didn't look amused. He hurried on. "I think you're an incredible woman. I know it hasn't been easy for you helping Isaac adjust, but please don't push me away." She kept her attention on Isaac and refused to look at him. When a tear escaped and rolled down her cheek, Josh wiped it away with his thumb and somehow fought the urge to wrap his arms around her. He wanted to hold her more than anything, but there was an unmistakable chasm between them, and it was widening. "My life isn't mine anymore, Josh. I have to look after Isaac's best interests. He seems to adore you." "That's a good thing, though, isn't it?" he interrupted. She kept her eyes on Isaac and didn't answer Josh right away, and with each passing second, he grew more and more concerned. "Melinda," he whispered. She finally looked at him, and the sadness in her gaze reached inside his chest and gripped his heart. "I can't risk a relationship right now. He's already been through so much." Josh took a step back. "You think I would just up and leave the two of you? Is that what's bothering you?" Melinda went back to her desk and sat down. "I just can't risk it right now. I can't risk anything. There's a big difference between spending a couple of nights rocking Isaac to sleep and spending a lifetime living with a child who's trying to adjust to a new way of life. His heart skipped a couple of beats when she said lifetime. He hoped that meant she'd thought about the possibility of spending a lifetime with him because it was all he'd thought about since the first night he'd seen them in the corridor outside his door. It was quick, ridiculously quick, but it was the truth. He wanted a lifetime with her and Isaac. Isaac started bouncing up and down in his playpen, shaking his rattle, and when Josh looked his way, a huge smile spread across his face. It was the first time Josh had seen him so excited and happy, and it was a kick to the gut knowing he might never get the chance to hold him again or spend time with him. Josh walked over to Melinda and turned her chair so she was forced to look at him. Could he convince her of his feelings for both her and her son? He knelt in front of her and held her hands, which made her bottom lip quiver and fresh tears swell in the corners of her eyes. "I'm not a runner, Melinda. I've fallen for you and Isaac. I don't do anything half-heartedly, and when I say I'm in, that's what I mean." She pulled her hands from his grip and wiped her eyes. "I'm sorry. I just can't do it, Josh. I can't risk it. I can't. You should probably go." He wanted to refuse, to grab onto her and not let go, but he could tell by the look in her eyes that he was treading on shaky ground. How quickly she'd given up on them. He hesitated, trying to imagine what she was feeling. Why she was so adamant about turning him away. He tried to think of how to convince her that he wanted to be a part of her life and Isaac's. How to convince her of his love. But the resolution on her face, the wall she'd put up, forced him to step away out of respect. So, outwardly, he nodded, but inwardly, he was determined that this wouldn't be the end of it. He leaned down and traced her cheek with his finger. He spoke softly, in a mere whisper. "Somehow, I'll make you understand how much you and Isaac mean to me. This isn't over." There was something there in her eyes that was undeniable, and he knew she was ready to burst into tears. But he couldn't force her. He wouldn't force her. Josh left her office and made his way back to the door leading to the sanctuary. When he walked through on his way to the front door, he saw Pastor Weeks sitting beside his podium thumbing through a Bible, but he didn't interrupt him. As he turned down the center aisle, he faintly heard the man clear his throat. Sometimes Melinda puts everyone else's needs before her own without realizing how much she's hurting herself. Josh stopped in his tracks and slowly turned to face Pastor Weeks, who stood and tucked his Bible under his arm before joining him in the aisle. "I was at the hospital the day she was born, so I've been with her every step of the way as she's grown into a remarkable woman. She has the biggest heart of any young woman I've ever known, but I also know how strong-willed she can be." Josh smiled at his comment. He had no idea what Melinda may have said to him about their relationship, so he didn't exactly know how to respond, but it did help him knowing someone else was aware of her stubbornness. She's been through a lot the past couple of years, working tirelessly to get Isaac here, and now dealing with the struggles that come with being a parent. But she needs someone to help her, to help take care of both her and Isaac. Not that she couldn't do alone. She's a tough one. But still, receiving help is part of God's plan for us. I hope I'm not overstepping my boundaries, but she's like a granddaughter to me, and I'm concerned for her happiness. Don't give up on her, son. Josh squared his shoulders and shook his head with conviction. I can promise you that won't happen, Pastor Weeks. I can be just as stubborn as she is, and I'm not about to give up. A big grin spread across the pastor's face as he reached out and squeezed Josh's shoulder. When they said their goodbyes and Josh headed for the front door, he was more convinced than ever that he would not give up on Melinda. He knew that the peace and contentment he felt over the situation was the Lord working in his life, and as long as God was by his side, he knew everything would turn out the way it was intended. Chapter 8. Melinda tried not to cry as she looked at the disaster area formerly known as her apartment. Diapers and wipes and blankets were strewn everywhere, dirty dishes were piled high in the kitchen sink. Her clothes hamper was overflowing, and there were two questionable stains on her carpet and recliner that needed cleaning. She glanced down at her t-shirt and winced when she noticed it was covered in what was clearly dried baby food and spit up. She couldn't remember the last time she'd brushed her hair, and as she ran her fingers through the long brown strands, she came across something mushy that turned out to be a piece of cooked spaghetti. The only bright spot in the room were the vases of flowers Josh had sent to her nearly daily since his visit to her office. Regularly, a delivery man from the florist appeared at her door around noon with a bouquet, and so far, each arrangement had been more interesting and original than the one before. The first day, she received 12 yellow roses with a note in Josh's handwriting that read, "You are a wonderful mother." The second day, she received daisies, and his note was, "You are beautiful." The third day, the delivery man showed up with pink roses and a note that read, "You are loved." Today's arrangement was white roses, and "You are cherished" was written in red ink on the card. She had to admit receiving them was the highlight of her day, for she desperately needed something to soothe her weary spirit. Isaac was doing much better with his new formula and was sleeping most of the night, but his improved mood brought a lot more than just a smile to his face. He was crawling and going nonstop all day long. Melinda was constantly chasing him to the point where she was physically exhausted every night when she crashed onto her bed. It was strange. She'd never been so dog-tired, but she'd also never been so fulfilled. Sometimes she thought she'd burst with her love for her son. With Isaac taking a nap in his crib, the apartment was unusually quiet, and it was a nice reprieve from the chaos. She didn't know how long she'd been sitting on the sofa, but every muscle in her body revolted when she attempted to get up. She shivered as an unexpected chill raced up her spine, followed by a sudden bout of sneezing. "Oh no," she moaned. "No, no, no." She pressed the back of her hand against her forehead and groaned when she felt the heat radiating from her skin. This could not be happening. She didn't have time to be sick. She pushed herself off the sofa and swayed precariously when the sudden movement made her lightheaded. Melinda leaned forward and grabbed her knees and took a couple of deep breaths to steady herself before attempting to walk to the kitchen. She opened a cabinet beside the refrigerator and sorted through her medicine stash to try and find something to take, but just 2 pills remained in the one and only box of cold medicine. She poured a glass of water and downed them both in one swallow before going back to the sofa to lie down. She needed extended rest, but she didn't see that happening in the near future. Her parents were gone, spending the rest of their spring break in the Smoky Mountains, and Jan was busy working double shifts at the hospital to earn some extra money. There was no one else to turn to, and she still hadn't found a babysitter for Isaac. Her eyelids felt heavy, and she closed them for a couple of minutes, but she was wide awake again when she heard Isaac whimpering. Her muscles and joints ached as she stood and went to his bedroom. Seeing him standing in his crib, holding onto the railing, brought a faint smile to her face. He'd been practicing standing for a couple of days now, and she knew it wouldn't be long before he wanted to walk. Her baby was growing up faster than she imagined he would, and the realization made her sad. "Hey, sweetie," she cooed as she picked him up and held him in her arms. "Did you have a good nap?" When he grinned at her, she hugged him close and kissed his forehead. Even in the chaos, he made everything worthwhile. No matter how crazy her life became, she knew how blessed she was, and she was grateful for every second of it. Melinda carried him to the living room and sat with him on the sofa. She gave him his bottle, and he guzzled it down. She sat him up and burped him, setting the empty bottle aside. He rubbed his eyes for a moment before he put a fist in his mouth and started whining. She'd noticed he was drooling a lot more than usual lately, and when she moved his hand aside and checked his gums, she saw 2 teeth trying to break through. Teething was another new thing she could add to her growing list of motherhood experiences. Melinda covered her mouth with her t-shirt when she started sneezing again, which startled Isaac and made him cry. She scooted to the edge of the sofa and tried to comfort him by rocking him, but he wouldn't hear of it. He pushed her away and jammed his little fist back in his mouth as tears formed in his eyes. Melinda couldn't take it anymore. Perhaps if she broke down and cried with him, it would help them both. He was cranky, and she was tired and sick, and it was the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. She stood and paced the floor with him, lightly bouncing him up and down to try and stop his tears, but it only seemed to make matters worse. Before long, Isaac was wailing so loudly she almost didn't hear the knock on her front door. She tried to hush his crying so she could listen, and there was no mistaking the second knock on her door. It was probably one of her neighbors wanting to complain about the noise. Between her aching body and Isaac's tantrum, she wasn't in the mood to deal with anything or anyone else, and her temper flared as she walked to the door and hurled it open. When she discovered it was Josh, she was so relieved she didn't know whether to smile or cry. Chapter 9. "Are you okay?" he asked. "You're as pale as a ghost." He touched her forehead and cheeks and immediately took Isaac from her before guiding her toward the living room. Isaac stopped crying, and part of her felt a little envious over the way Josh had such a calming effect on him. But then again, she was always more content when Josh was near, too. "I want you to go to your room and get into bed." No arguing. Part of her wanted to fight with him, but an even bigger part of her wanted to crawl to her bedroom and do exactly what he said. "I can handle this," she said as a bout of coughing seized her. He shook his head before reaching out to caress her cheek. His hand was soft and warm and soothing, and Melinda sighed as she closed her eyes. "I have no doubt about that. But you're tired and worn out and you need rest. Let me help you, and Isaac too. Now go." She didn't have the strength to disagree with him, so she numbly nodded her head and went to her bedroom. She didn't bother changing clothes, and as soon as she nestled under the covers, she fell into a deep sleep. When she woke up, the sunlight peeking through her curtain had been replaced by the moonlight. She glanced at the clock beside her bed and was shocked to discover she'd slept for 7 hours straight. Her thoughts instantly turned to Josh, and she eased out of bed so she could go check on him and Isaac. Her muscles still ached, but she couldn't remember the last time she'd slept for 7 hours. She opened her bedroom door, and her gaze widened when she noticed Josh had cleaned the apartment. Toys were put away and the whole place was spotless. Josh was nowhere to be seen, but she heard him humming from Isaac's bedroom. When she walked past the kitchen, she saw the sink was void of dirty dishes and the countertops were clear of debris. She even heard the washing machine running when she passed the utility room. Josh turned to look at her when she appeared in Isaac's doorway, and he held a finger to his lips, motioning for her to be quiet as he softly hummed. She tiptoed to his side and looked over into Isaac's crib, where he was sleeping soundly. Her heart swelled when she saw his tiny lips were puckered, but she resisted the urge to sweep him up in her arms and cover his face with kisses. Josh pointed to the door and they backed away slowly so as not to awaken him, and when Josh eased the door closed behind them, Melinda leaned against him and then hugged him. He seemed surprised at first, but it wasn't long before his arms circled her waist and he squeezed her back. "Thank you for cleaning the apartment and taking care of us," she whispered in his ear. He rubbed his hands across her back, and Melinda closed her eyes and enjoyed the feeling of his strong hands on her body. "Thank you for letting me," he replied. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." They made their way to the living room. She noticed he'd spread the flower arrangements around the entire apartment, and they looked even more beautiful that way. "The flowers are lovely," she remarked. "I never properly thanked you." "I'm sorry. You deserve to be treated like the amazing woman you are." "The flowers aren't nearly enough." She'd never had a man treat her so tenderly before, and she felt her face redden in response to his compliment. "How do you feel?" he asked, before pressing the back of his fingers to her forehead and cheeks. "You're still a little warm." Melinda moved to the sofa and sank down onto it. She still felt a little woozy, but not nearly as bad as she'd felt before she'd slept. "I feel somewhat better, but I don't have any cold medicine left. I took the last 2 pills right before you got here." Josh grabbed a couple of throw pillows on the sofa and fluffed them before putting them behind her back. I have some in my apartment. Stay where you are. I'll be right back. He headed for the front door and Melinda relaxed against the pillows to wait for him. After he left, she looked around the room and took a moment to enjoy the vast difference from earlier that day. Now the apartment was clean, peaceful, and the atmosphere was totally different. Still, she couldn't forget their discussion at the church, and it plagued her as she took in all the wonderful things he'd done for her. Her reasons for not getting involved were still valid, and she couldn't let her feelings cloud her judgment. It was Friday night, and Josh should be out enjoying himself instead of cleaning her apartment, doing her laundry, and tending to her child's needs. She should be the one in charge of those things. This whole scenario wasn't right. Josh reappeared a few minutes later, carrying a plastic bag in one hand and big jug of orange juice in the other. He took them to the kitchen and looked through the bag before pulling out a box of medicine, which he brought to her along with a glass of juice. Here you go, he said. Maybe this will help. He pulled up an ottoman and sat down in front of her as she took 2 pills from the box and swallowed them in one gulp. Without wanting to, she focused her attention on him, and a warm rush flowed through her veins when she noticed how handsome he looked in his jeans and t-shirt. It was one of the few times she'd seen him in something other than his dress clothes, and his green shirt brought out the amazing green in his eyes and made her pulse quicken. I would love to kiss you right now, he whispered. Melinda jerked upright. But I meant what I said. She stammered. I can't have a relationship right now. He put his hand on her arm. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. I don't want to pressure you. She leaned back against the cushions again. But Melinda. What? She murmured. I would love to kiss you right now, he repeated and pouted his lips, which made her laugh despite herself. You'd just get sick anyway, she said. I tell you what, he said. Why don't you go take a hot shower and I'll fix you something to eat? I know you must be starving and you need to keep your strength up. Melinda sighed. His never-ending kindness made her feel both grateful and guilty. You don't have to do that. You've already done so much. And I'm better now. He shook his head as he helped her stand. Her legs felt rubbery, and when she rocked back and forth a bit, he caught her around the waist and held on tight. I am going to keep helping you, and I won't take no for an answer, he replied emphatically. Now, go take a shower and take as long as you need. It will help you feel better. Melinda had to admit it sounded lovely, and she was learning that it was futile to argue with him anyway once he had his mind made up, so she shuffled her way to her bedroom while he went to the kitchen. She heard him searching through the cupboards for something to prepare. She grabbed some clothes from her dresser and went to the adjoining bathroom and locked the door. She turned on the faucet and stepped inside. The steam rose around her and she closed her eyes and breathed it in. She didn't know how long she spent in the shower, but once the warm water started flowing over her aching muscles, she felt the tension slowly ebb from her body. She couldn't recall the last time she'd been able to indulge in such a long, hot shower, but it was some time before Isaac's arrival, so she took her time and enjoyed every second. By the time she turned off the water and stepped out of the shower to dry off, she felt rejuvenated. She hurriedly dried her hair and got dressed so she could rejoin Josh in the living room, and when she opened the bathroom door, a wonderful aroma tickled her nose and made her mouth water. She walked to the kitchen, where Josh was busy ladling what looked like chicken noodle soup into 2 bowls. He smiled at her when he caught her standing in the doorway. Better? He asked. She nodded, walked over to one of the kitchen cabinets, and retrieved 2 drinking glasses. I feel much better. Thanks, she replied. That smells delicious. She poured orange juice in the glasses and carried them to the dining room table. My mom always fixed me chicken noodle soup when I felt crummy. It's the best remedy I know of to cure a cold, he told her. He brought the bowls and spoons to the dining room, and when he set hers down in front of her, her stomach started rumbling from sheer hunger. Before they ate, Josh reached across the table, held her hand, and prayed over their meal. It was a sweet prayer that gave her a comforting feeling, much like when she lived at home and her father would say the blessing every night at dinner. It was then she realized why the atmosphere in her apartment felt so different with Josh there. Felt like home. A true family home. She swallowed past the lump of emotion in her throat. "I meant to tell you that I found a babysitter for you," he said. "I talked to my brothers and sisters, and two of them recommended a young woman from their church who operates a daycare from her home. Their kids loved her, and she has an opening. I can get her phone number for you if you like." It was the best news Melinda had heard all week, and she agreed to it right away. With her leave of absence gone and her vacation days quickly coming to an end, she was running out of options, and this woman sounded perfect. With one thing less to worry about, she could focus on other things that needed taken care of before returning to work. Melinda tried not to slurp down her soup, but it was delicious, and she was more famished than she realized. The hot soup warmed her bones and her soul. When they finished, Josh took her hand in his again, and they talked about Isaac and work and everything else in between. It was an easygoing conversation that felt natural and right, as if they'd eaten dinner together as a couple a million times before. "I'd like to stay here this weekend if you'll let me." The thought of having him under her roof made her heart pound, and she didn't know how to respond as the heat spread to her face, but he quickly dispelled any doubts and fears. "Let me rephrase that," he said with a smile. "I'd like to stay here and take care of you. I'll sleep on the couch and watch Isaac for you so you can get some rest and take the time you need to get well." Melinda could think of nothing she wanted more than to spend as much time with him as possible, but there was still so much change and confusion to contend with. She picked up her bowl and glass and went to the kitchen to avoid looking at him. Finally, she spoke. "It's very sweet of you to offer, but I'm sure you probably have better things to do this weekend, and I don't want to keep you from them." He followed her into the kitchen, and after they both put their bowls and glasses in the sink, he rested his hands on her waist and turned her around so she had no other choice but to face him. She saw the stubbornness in his eyes, and there was also what resembled disappointment, too. "I'm not asking like a friend offering their help to another friend. I'm asking as a man who has fallen desperately in love with you and wants to do everything in his power to be with you and take care of you." Her breath caught and her lips parted. She could no longer doubt his words or his sincerity. But still, she could hardly believe her amazing fortune. "Has anyone told you how stubborn you are?" He continued. "I said I wouldn't give up on us, and I won't. If I have to beg and plead to make you understand how much you mean to me, I will." Melinda shook her head, working to wrap her mind around his words. Stubborn? Did he say she was stubborn? In the light of everything going on in her life, it suddenly seemed hilarious. She put a hand on his chest and laughed. "I've been called that a time or two." Josh cupped her face in his hands and tenderly kissed her forehead. "So you love me?" she whispered. "Completely," he whispered back. Somewhere inside her, a warm glow started. Gently at first, and then growing until she felt consumed with it. He gave her a glowing smile before leaving a trail of kisses from her forehead to her cheeks and down the side of her neck. Her body trembled beneath his touch, and she gripped him hard when a shiver coursed up her back, making her moan. "We really need to get you well," he mumbled. Melinda grinned as she pulled away from him slightly. "I agree." She brushed her fingertips against his lips and swallowed hard. The temptation was almost too much to bear, but she knew it was best for them to go slowly. She was determined to take her time and not rush into anything, especially for Isaac's sake. "You're a wonderful mother," he said. "You are beautiful. You're loved and cherished. And I look forward to telling you that every day for as long as you live." Her heart was full to bursting as she put her arms around his neck. He held her tightly and nearly lifted her feet off the floor. She wished they could stay that way forever, but they were interrupted by the sound of Isaac's cry from his room. Josh set her down, and they both hurried to see what he was doing. As Melinda eased the door open, she heard him cooing and babbling, which made her heart swell, and when they peeked over the side of his crib, they both laughed when they saw him holding onto his feet and trying to pull them into his mouth. Josh scooped him up in his arms. "Hey, little man. Are you hungry?" he asked. Melinda smiled contentedly as she watched the two of them together. She knew that she and Isaac were a family by themselves, but with Josh too, her world felt complete and right, and it was all because God had blessed her with these two amazing people. She couldn't wait to make a lifetime of memories with them, memories that would find their way inside the picture frames on her walls and fill up dozens of photo albums that they would reminisce over for many years to come. Josh and Isaac were her destiny and what God had been preparing her for all along. She and Josh and Isaac, a beautiful family of her very own. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Marjorie Evans. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Marjorie Evans, as well as the other authors at Ticah House Publishing, visit www.ticahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Marjorie Evans romance.